World War II is happening, and every corner in the world has its own issues. As you guys already know, Japan was allies with Nazi Germany, and they were part of the Axis powers. You have to know that the US wasn't in the first 2 years of the war, and you could say they were watching from afar, but Japan wanted everything, and they were even looking to take over the US. Even though half of the world was at war at that point, Japan wanted to use the opportunity and make the US join the war and defeat them. And that is why on December 7th, 1941, Japanese warships and planes attacked Pearl Harbor. And it was in Hawaii, which was US land. Four days after this attack, meaning on December 11th, 1941, Japan got what it wanted. The US entered the war. When the US declared war on the Axis powers, there was over 100,000 Japanese Americans living in the US, and they immigrated years ago, and most of them were born in the United States. You've probably seen Trump sign a contract and show it to the camera. Some of the things he signs are called executive order. And that means it has to be done right now immediately, and it doesn't have to go through the Congress. And Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. In this order, any Japanese, half Japanese, a quarter Japanese, if you're married to a Japanese, you are considered evil and should go to a camp. You have to first notice that these are US citizens, and the law says a citizen should never go to jail before seeing a judge. You can arrest them, but you can't put them in prison before a judge says so. But the executive order of the president is bigger than all of this. There was a law that said even if you're a little bit Japanese, you have to report yourself to a camp. These Japanese American, because of an executive order, lost everything they had. Even their bank account got frozen. The Japanese Americans were forced out of their house into a camp. The people that had luggage put their stuff in there and went to the camp. But the poor people that didn't have any luggage and their bank account was frozen didn't have anything to put their stuff in. That is why they gave them 2 trash bags. More than 120,000 Japanese Americans, which some of them were a little bit Japanese, entered these camps. These people were law-abiding citizens. They would pay their taxes and didn't break any rules, but they were forced into these camps. They were not really camps, they were prisons built in US Army bases around the United States. There were barbed wires blocking everybody off, and it was filled with watchtowers with soldiers. If you were planning on escaping this place, you would get shot. Most of these Japanese Americans lived in the west coast of the United States, meaning California, Washington, and Oregon. And the camps were also on the west side of the United States. A really bad life was waiting for these Americans. These buildings were all made with plywood and 2x4s and didn't have any insulation. And even the doors had an empty spot on the bottom. That means in the winter they will be extremely cold, and in the summer extremely hot. You also have to know that there were a lot of kids in these camps. This attack on Pearl Harbor caused Japanese name to be extremely evil in the US, and there was extreme racism going on. This racism was also taught to the Japanese kids, and they didn't help them in any way. During the day, they would take them into a quote-unquote classroom and teach them stuff. And to the grown people, they had to do hard labor. They would take them outside and give them random jobs, mostly farming. They would make them work for hours. These camps, or should I say prisons, continued until 1944, and that's when the Supreme Court of the United States said that these things we're doing to the US citizens is against the Constitution, and a US citizen should not go to prison before seeing a judge. But the military would deny this and said we're still at war with the Japanese. And finally, in 1945, these camps were closed. But don't think they went back to their home and their job. They were gone for nearly 3 years. If they were renting a house, long time ago, the landlord had kicked their stuff out. If they had a house, they missed payments or didn't pay property tax and it was foreclosed. If they had a job, they were already fired. You could say there was more than 100,000 Japanese with no jobs or no home to go to. And after World War II, the racism towards the Japanese Americans got even worse. Everywhere you went, on the door, it said no Japanese. And they could not get a job. The Japanese were suffering the same as the African Americans in the United States, and they worked alongside with them. World War II ended and the Japanese lost, but the racism against the Japanese continued. They didn't apologize to them, they didn't give any of their stuff back, and they didn't help them out with any money. But eventually, they continued their life. Then in 1988, meaning after 43 years, Ronald Reagan, the president at the time, apologized to the Japanese Americans and said that the Japanese Americans suffered for more than 40 years because of this. The US eventually apologized. Unfortunately, the Japanese didn't though. If you've seen the video about Unit 731 in Japan, you'll know that the Japanese never apologized for what they did to those people in those camps, and they also look at the people that did all this as heroes and look up to them. You see what war does to people? Even though more than 70 years has passed from this war, the scars are still around the world. Hopefully we get to a day where humans get along instead of going to war. Please comment, what do you guys think?